welcome back to another episode of the Nocturnal Unwrap podcast. My name is Phila and I'm one of your hosts. I'm joined today by my good friend and co-host, and it's actually the first time that him and I are hosting the podcast together, so I'm pretty excited about that. But of course, I'm also excited by the conversation that Simo and I are going to have today, and of course, the stature of guests that we have to discuss today's episode with. But without being too long-winded and wasting too much time, I want to try and get Simo to get a word out before we introduce our guest. Simo, how are you doing, bro?
I'm doing great, bro. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's a good day. Can't complain. No complaints from my side.
Yeah. Finally,
Cool, man.
Finally. It's taken
Yeah,
about
it's
8
been
months for us to do this, and
yeah,
finally we're here.
yeah. No, I'm excited, man. I'm excited. And as I said, I'm excited not only about the prospect of having the conversation and hosting it with you, but also by the guest that we have to discuss this with. I want to try and introduce the guest. I think it's important that we perhaps, before I do that, give a bit of a background to how this conversation actually came to be. I mentioned to our guest that I actually recorded a podcast last year in Stellenbosch with Professor Stan du Plessis, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Stellenbosch University. That podcast, for those who are interested in listening to it, we'll link it in the descriptor of this video as well, is called Sound and Unsound Money. So essentially what that conversation sought to do was to talk about the history of money. And we were using the Bitcoin standard as an anchor for that conversation. And in one of the segments of the discussion, Professor du Plessis brought up a particular factoid that I thought was pretty interesting, after which he recommended that we talk to today's guest. He mentioned that there was a particular butcher in the Overberg that was so successful and was so established on such a large scale that some of the tokens that he was issuing out actually circulated to a limited extent as money in a particular society. So for those who actually know or who have listened to the conversation, they'll know who I'm talking about exactly. But I don't want to waste too much time. I want to try and introduce the guest. We're joined today by Stellenbosch University's Professor Johan Fourie. Professor Fourie studied economics at Stellenbosch University between 2001 and 2007, after which he went to the Netherlands, at Utrecht University to study his PhD in economic history. He's also, incidentally, the author of the book that's the subject of our discussion today, which is titled, as Simo is showing it, Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, Lessons from 100,000 Years of Human History. Prof. Fourie, what an absolute privilege it is to talk to you. Thank you so much for making the time, and I cannot wait to get this discussion started.
Thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me on this important day as well.
No, it's a great privilege. And as far as birthday presents go, this is a pretty good one. It's right up there. Simo, do you have any questions for Prof. Fourie before we begin?
So good morning, Prof. Fourie, on this important day. So we have your book in front of us. I have actually read it, and it's a very, very good and interesting read. So before we get into the nitty-gritties of the book, I was wondering perhaps you could introduce yourself to our listeners. After Phila's intro, you can introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit more about yourself, why you got into history, economic history, why you got into economics.
Sure, it's wonderful to be here, and I think that's already a pretty good introduction. So I'll just say that I think a lot of things in life happen serendipitously. So, and that's basically why I got into economic history. I studied here at Stellenbosch, and then I was a trade economist. I was appointed in 2006 and teaching international trade and first years and second years macro. And then randomly, one of my colleagues here and friends proposed that we write a paper together where we found some ship traffic data of South Africa, and we wrote this paper and presented it at a conference in Portugal. And there I randomly met a professor who said to me at some stage, well, why don't you do a PhD in economic history? This seems like a fascinating data set. It seems like a fascinating time period to study. And so through this kind of happenstance way, I entered the field of economic history, and I really haven't looked back since. So I finished my PhD in 2012, and really for the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching economic history at the undergraduate and graduate level here at Stellenbosch. Several students have come through, PhD students that are now in other universities in South Africa or doing postdocs abroad. So it's really kind of nice to have established this kind of center for economic history. And of course, now the book has taken it beyond the university, and I've been able to engage with a much broader audience, which has really been lovely and naturally has been in a way kind of revealing of the things that people know and don't know. So I've really enjoyed the engagement.
You wrote this. Was it always your intention to write this book, or was it similar happenstance that you stumbled upon?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's COVID in 2020. 2020, at the beginning of COVID, or of lockdown at least, I was forced to teach my course online. And it's a course which is quite difficult to teach because it's quite an interactive course. And as you know, I think students don't love interacting online. And so I just thought the students are going to get a worse product if I just do this online. And so I started writing up my lectures. And at some stage, some of the students were saying, well, I enjoyed reading these lectures, but my parents and my brother, and they've enjoyed reading the lectures as well. And I thought, well, maybe this is kind of useful for a broad audience. And I happened to know a publisher, and she said to me, well, why don't you send it to like 1 or 2 or 3 publishers? And only one of them got back. I sent 3 emails, I think, and only one got back and said, well, let's give it a try. So it was never really an intention to write a book from the start. It kind of developed over time, but it was the ideas of within the book had been developed, for the last decade, basically. So it's not something that I planned and structured and then wrote. It was something that was already kind of within me, and then it was much easier to do so. I mean, some of those chapters I wrote basically, in one day. So it was there, and yeah, I think some of those earlier chapters was pretty easy to write because I knew everything that I wanted to say. Some of the later chapters took a while, but the earlier ones were pretty quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and maybe just to get maybe to the contents of the book, because I'm sure the listeners and viewers would like to obviously know a bit more about the book. I mean, I know that there's a second edition that's on its way. I'm not sure if it's out yet, and I'm not sure how different it will be from the current copy that Simo and I have read. But I presume, as I've heard you speaking on previous interviews, that it'll have about 2 more chapters. I'm not sure if I've got that accurately, but I'll give you a chance to maybe just say a bit more about the book. Obviously not revealing too much, but yeah, just to give us a sense of what it is that we can expect from the book. So I mentioned before I introduced you, Prof, that I had a conversation with Prof. Du Plessis in which we discussed the history of money. And I thought it would be important for us to discuss more broadly the history of economics. And that's why I actually thought it was important to have this discussion with you. And of course, when I have some of these discussions, I've had a lot of debates and discussions with friends that have gone on well into about economics and about history more generally. And it's my realization that there is a view that has been allowed to develop and perhaps even to coagulate in the mainstream. And it is that it is only those of us who have pro-market inclinations that have any explanations to give. And I mean, as far as I can tell, if history and economic history more specifically is anything to go by, I mean, we should be the ones demanding explanations from those that demand them from us. So, I mean, when we talk about economic history, I think there's a lot of optimism that, we can derive from it. And of course, that's, contention nowadays. But I mean, I don't want to be too long-winded. I just wanted to talk very quickly about, obviously, the point that I've just made now about, the contention that those of us who espouse pro-market ideas and the kind of backlash that we get. So, and I think you actually hint at this and you actually try to deal with it in the book. And one clue that you give in the title of the book is with the words economic freedom. And we, of course, know in South Africa that the terms economic freedom are not so much associated with the kind of economic freedom that those of us who espouse these pro-market ideas have come or have become acquainted with. So why that title? Hey, I thought it was a very interesting title. I think the choice of the words was quite interesting. So do you maybe wish to talk a bit more about why those particular words and whether you mean what the guys with the red berets mean by economic freedom?
Yeah, well, there are many questions in that question. So let me start with the final one first, and then you can kind of pull me back on the road again if I get distracted. I think actually we do mean the same thing when the EFF. Obviously, I can't speak for them, but my suspicion is that we share the same vision about what we want, and that is that people have economic freedom. And what do I mean with that is the ability to produce what you want, so work where you want to work, have a job that is a fulfilling job. Firstly, have a job. I think that's obviously within the South African context important, but also one that is fulfilling, that you grow up to be whatever you want to be. And I think we're certainly not there yet. And secondly, then consume what you want, right? So there are very high levels of poverty still in South Africa. And so clearly there are a lot of people that would want to consume, better housing, better, more nutritious food, all of these things that they want, leisure, that they can't consume, right? So there's, in a very, very kind of basic sense, economic freedom is the ability to consume and produce what you want. Right? And of course, I must say, historically, for most South Africans, that has not been the case, right? There were rules and regulations that prevented where people can live, what type of jobs they can fill, what type of education they can have. And so it is certainly South Africa is one where these freedoms were restricted, where they inhibited. So I think that's the ultimate goal. The question is how we get there, right? And I think that's where we differ probably from, or at least where my view would differ from EFF, for example, view, right? So I think they would attach a much greater role for the state to be involved. And I think you alluded to the fact that I think if we study economic history, you understand the role, the incredibly powerful role that the market can play in creating prosperity, right? So I think ultimately the market, it's not to say that there should only be a market, there should be no government. Of course, there should be a government. There's many things where the market failed, but I think the majority or the dominant role should be that of kind of the market approach. And the reason I say that is because we've tried many different approaches in history, right? So you can study history and you know that there are basically three ways of solving, the economic problems of production and distribution. So that's really what economic freedom is about. How do we produce enough things, the right things, and how do we distribute it fairly and equitably? And we've tried, the tradition approach, for example, so that is typically, you do basically the same things that your parents did, and you just continue that system. It's in a sense, it's a very simple system, but it doesn't really lead to any innovation. Right? Or you can have this kind of state command type approach, which is like there's a government or a command council, right? In South Africa, we know this term quite well, that dictates what should be produced. Now that sounds, in a way, it sounds quite an appealing thing to do, because now there's some dynamism in the system. You can build a pyramid, or you can build, something big and infrastructure, all of this, and that's great. But the problem there is that people lose freedom, so they don't have individual choice anymore. Like you have to do what the state tells you to do. Right? And the third one is basically the Adam Smith kind of approach of just let people do whatever they want. Now that seems crazy, right? To just let people do, but ultimately it's about people reacting to the price mechanism. So prices dictate, right? All our collective decisions are captured in the price of things. And of course, that means that we should try and have a competitive system. So we should have many buyers, we should have many sellers, because then ultimately the price is an efficient and equitable way of distributing things. But if you have a monopoly, for example, then typically they set monopoly prices, and so that creates inefficiencies in the system. So again, that's perhaps where the government can intervene to help this market system become more efficient and more equitable. But ultimately, it's still the market that makes these decisions. So I think that's really the lessons from history, and how we can, or at least my view of it, is how the types of policies that we set going forward can get us to a more economically free society. I think just in terms of the title, I think, yeah, of course, it alludes to Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. There's a reason for that, in that the book is about global economic history, but it's written from a South African or African perspective. And so I really want to make that point already in the title, right? So that, and I think as soon as you see the title, you already know that this is from a South African perspective. So that's great. But I do think the most important word actually in the title is the hour, right? So most people kind of forget actually the hour when they kind of talk about the book, but it's so essential, because ultimately economic history is about cooperation, right? The idea that we are in this market together is an idea that we have trust between one another. You spoke to Professor du Plessis about money. Money is a construct that relies entirely on trust, right? There wouldn't be any money if there is no trust. I think Harari, this historian from Jerusalem, who wrote *Sapiens*, makes that point very, very clearly, that it's all about trust. And trust requires inevitably, cooperation, and they are, and so I think that's the fundamental thing about that we need to understand going forward, is that as soon as these relationships between people in South Africa break down and we lose the trust in one another, that also has economic implications, right? There is other implications obviously as well, but it means that we have to start becoming more independent. But as soon as we become more independent, we become poorer, right? So hunter-gatherer societies, for example, are incredibly independent, right? They can survive on their own for millions of years, but they're also poor. The richest societies in the world are incredibly interdependent. They specialize in this one narrow thing, and they buy all their services, their housing, their clothing, their food, everything from other people. And so that's really the kind of society we want to live in, but that relies on trust. It means that if I go to a shop and I should be able to offer them my money, and they should accept that money, and I would be able to purchase it. That's an incredibly, it's such an incredible innovation, and we kind of forget it. We think we take it for granted, but as soon as societies break down, this trust in war or whatever breaks down, you very quickly realize that is really what underpins our prosperity. So I'm not sure if I've answered all the questions in there. Perhaps just the final thing, when you started out, you mentioned something about the new book. So let me just say that the book was published. The first one was published in 2021 by Tafelberg in South Africa. So that's the South African edition. There's a new international edition coming out actually as we speak. It's being delivered at my home, so it's now in print, and it's slightly a longer version. It's about 10,000 words more. There's a new chapter on war actually, which was quite fortuitous because I wrote this already last year before the Russia-Ukrainian war, and hopefully this will also be published next year in South Africa. So a revised version will be published, the second edition. But I think they are, I think the one that you certainly reviewed is, in my mind, that's 95% of what is in the book is the main message. And so I don't think the second version will, it's not going to tell a different story. It's the same story, perhaps, with a little bit more footnotes because it's a Cambridge University Press edition. So I think that's really the kind of the main message.
So a few things to pick up on. So you mentioned, of course, the hunter-gatherer societies, which are hugely independent. I think a common day or current day example would be North Korea. North Korea is also quite independent. And of course, we know about the destitution over there. But what I like quite a bit about your book, having read, and I mean, having admitted this in previous podcasts as well, I'm a huge admirer of Hayek and by extension, Adam Smith as well. So when you talk about the price mechanism, I get excited because it says to me that we're on the same page. There's a very interesting book that I'm reading at the moment by Thomas Sowell that's known as Knowledge and Decisions. And there is a very interesting passage that I flagged because I foresaw that you would talk about the price mechanism. And I just quickly want to read that excerpt before we get into the contents of the book, if you, of course, won't mind. And before I hand over to Simo for his questions. This is from Sowell's chapter known as The Role of Knowledge. How does an ignorant world perform intricate functions requiring enormous knowledge? The intricate functions include not only such scientific feats as air travel and space exploration, but also the complex economic processes that bring a slice of bread and a piece of butter to your plate at breakfast. Anyone who has studied the actual process by which these food items are planned, produced, and distributed knows that the complexity staggers the mind. Many highly intelligent and highly trained people spend a lifetime studying it and learning more all the time. Among those who speculate financially in such commodities, economic disaster is commonplace, even after they have spent years studying the market. In short, individually we know so pathetically little, and yet socially we use a range of complexity and knowledge which would confound a computer. The question is not only how given institutions, including whole societies, manage to do this, but how various institutions and societies differ in the manner and effectiveness with which they do it, and what to do, the historic and continuing changes in the way they perform or function to portend for the future, which really, for me, I think encapsulates what Hayek wrote about in The Use of Knowledge in Society, that wonderful essay of his, but also I think what you espouse in the book about collaboration and how interconnected we are as a globe. And that the only way we're able to produce anything approximating the kind of wealth that sustains us is through this, interconnected web of collaboration that Sowell and of course you write so eloquently about in your book.
And I think the strange thing for me is often is how little we think about this. And so my students would often, I would say, well, why would we want to be a country that's kind of independent from the global system, right? This is quite an appealing thought for many, is to say South Africa should produce its own food, it should produce its own clothes. And my question is always, why, right? And when I make that point, I say to them, well, you are sitting at a university and the purpose of, I imagine that you're here is to, obtain an education, to specialize, you study, financial planning, you study law, and you become so specialized that you obviously, the more specialized you are, the higher your salary, right? And it means that you're only going to do that one thing, which means that everything else that you need, you're going to buy, right? So you are not going independent. If you were to go independent, you would go and live in the Karoo, you would have your own solar panels, and you wouldn't make those solar panels yourself. You would still buy that, but you would go off the grid and live an independent life. But that would ultimately be a very kind of impoverished life if you have to produce everything yourself, your own clothes, all of these kind of things. Yet you want that for South Africa, right? You want it at the country level, but you don't believe it, or you don't certainly do it yourself. And it's that disconnect that sometimes frustrates me, because we the way we behave, the way we operate is is completely counter to what we think we believe about the world, that we should be somehow independent or autarkic, or, and just produce our own things. And so that's really something that I hope the book will bring to light, is the fact that the way we kind of do things are often very different from what we at least communicate that we think is important.
Sure. So the parts that stuck out to me in the book, well, firstly, I'm not as amped on economics as the both of you guys are, I suppose. So the part that stuck out for me is that when I started reading, I realized, oh, this is a book about history. So, and I'm a big fan of history. And my favorite part about history and what this book shows is that nothing much is actually new. The social, political, and the economic issues that existed in the past, they often exist now too. In the book, you even quote Mark Twain, where you say, history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. This is evidenced by many things in the book itself. You also you talk about the similarities between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. History will also show us how the nationalizing of lands and banks has gone, and that's relevant now to some issues because some political parties, obviously advocate for that. So what I will commend about the book is that it's actually a meaningful gateway into the future. I also found the book quite useful because it has a lot of very interesting factoids, which I hope to remember when I enter for Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Like, for instance, now I know that Mansa Musa existed in the 14th century. He was incredibly rich. He was a generous gift giver. All of these factoids about Africa, they're interesting too as well. So you went into a lot of detail, and I'm sure a lot of research went into this. So we commend you for that.
Yeah, thanks. I think, so the Mansa Musa is interesting because at the beginning of every year in my second year class, I start with a test, which is not always very, students, they get this kind of fright when I say we're going to start with a test. But I basically show them a map of Africa and a blank map, basically just the country outlines. And then I have like 5 countries listed, say, Botswana and Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, and maybe like a more difficult one like Mauritania or something. And I asked them to name those countries. And I'm always surprised. It's, the average has basically been the same for the last decade, and it's almost always, just above 1. So basically the average student doesn't know much about the continent, and the implication is they also don't know anything about its history. And that's, to me, I would have expected that to be the case for students in Europe or the US perhaps, but it's it's really surprising that this is the case for African students, right? That we are so, maybe that's because of our South African exceptionalism, that we think that we are somehow
we're special.
Exactly. But it is a bit sad, and so partly again this book is it's dual purposed. In the one sense, I want to write to an international audience to tell them the stories of Africa, right? So put global economic history in an African perspective. But secondly, it's also important for our students, right? To and not only students, obviously the kind of general reader as well, to know that these stories also fit into a global story. That it's not just that somehow there are these industrial revolutions and Protestant reformations and all of these kind of big events, and then kind of African stories on the side. That it's actually that these stories are part of a kind of a global story, and I think that's I think we've been relatively successful in doing that. It's not always easy because the literature is kind of limited also on kind of African history and African economic history specifically. But I think these kind of anecdotes, the Mansa Musa one specifically, is a great way of getting into the 14th, 15th century, this amazing West African education and the preservation of literary resources, many of whom are now actually being kind of rediscovered. It's stories that we typically do not even think of, or certainly do much research about, and hopefully this will encourage more readers to look into them.
Yeah, no, maybe if I can also just put in a word there. So I think what I appreciated most about the book is, obviously being a fan of economics and history more generally myself, what I found about the book, or what I found most appealing about the book, was that it puts Africa slap bang in the middle, no longer on the fringes and on the margins of economic history. in a way that I think was quite refreshing to read, and in a way that I think the viewers will themselves find quite refreshing. But I also think that the crucial thing that it did for me was to show that there are many ways of thinking about history, and that we shouldn't just be limited to thinking about history in terms of politics and all the social events that happen, and that in fact most of them are underpinned and undergirded by economic forces, which for me, and in fact, like it was such a refreshing way of viewing history, and it just really introduced me to a way of thinking that I'd never really explored and that I never really thought existed. I mean, I think one of my most fascinating chapters, or one of the chapters that I found most fascinating, is that about dowry and how the ratio of land to labor actually contributed to that. So I know that some of the listeners will probably be curious about that, and I don't want to butcher it by saying it myself, so I'll give it to you, Prof, to explain from an economic perspective how such concepts, such social concepts actually came to be.
Yeah, I think the first point to make is you're perfectly right that we often, when we think of any event, right, even a contemporary event or any kind of major issue at the moment, we typically want to paint that through the a political lens or a social lens, and ultimately, I'm a strong believer that many of these things have economic roots. And so, in the book, that the one of the things, for example, I write about, one of the chapters is about colonialism and how basically, we've certainly before I became an economic historian, the way I would think about colonialism would have been through a racial lens, right? So it's clearly like some kind of discriminatory racial policy. And then you go and kind of do some analysis and you actually realize, well, yeah, sure, these guys motivated in a racial context and in racialized language. But ultimately, it had economic roots. And you can see that when you look at the terms of trade. The Berlin Conference happened at exactly the time when African commodities become basically incredibly lucrative. So, if you want to say colonialism was just a racial construct, then you have to argue, well, why didn't it happen 10 or 15 years earlier, right? And it's not as if people suddenly became more racialized in the late 19th century or more racist. So I think it's ultimately these economic motivations that help me understand many of the things that we typically think of as just like, these are common explanations for things. So you're right. The one of the very kind of deeply embedded cultural entities, I guess, of our time is and there are many different kinds of cultural practices, I guess, in many of South Africa's different groupings that actually have deep historical roots, the Bola being one of them. And the explanation there is basically because of factor endowment. So what is a factor? It's basically, as you mentioned, this ratio of land to labor. So Africa is a massive continent in terms of its size, land size. And it's actually got very few people, right? For a variety of reasons. There are few water sources. The soil quality is not always that great. There's a very large disease burden. So Africa traditionally had very few people given its size of land. Whereas, for example, India had a tiny subcontinent with, many people. And that's obviously still the case today. So this ratio kind of really affects the types of cultural practices that develop. And one of them is the Bola. So for example, in Africa, if two neighboring clans were at war, because labor is the scarce resource, not land. Land is abundantly available. When you engage in war, you're not really interested in your neighbor's land because there's a lot of that. You're interested in your neighbor's people, and so slavery develops because that's the one thing that you care about, right? So you steal their people, you don't steal their land. Whereas if you're in India or in Europe, you care about the land because the land is the scarce commodity. So you don't care so much about, you kill off the people or whatever, you don't care about the people, you care really about the land. So property rights, for example, developed in different ways, more in people in Africa and in land in Europe and in India. And also then, because labor is so scarce in Africa, the reproductive ability of women become incredibly important. So women are actually treasured much more in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And that also gives rise to like institutions like polygamy. So if you have a very wealthy man, then again, what you want is women who can produce many children. So you're more likely to have multiple women. And also the Bola is an institution that's generated through that because, again, if you're a wealthy man, you're willing to pay the parents of your future wife to have that woman's access to that woman's reproductive ability. In India, if you are the father of a daughter, you're willing to pay to have that daughter married off to someone with land. So the dowry develops in India, the lobola in Africa. So, and those things then persist, right? Even though those land labor ratios do not matter anymore, right? We are not in a pre-colonial economy anymore, only relying on agriculture, yet those practices persist. And they actually have really interesting consequences today, which I'm not going to go into, but I think that's a fascinating area for research. Like what practices or institutions that were developed many hundreds of years ago, how do those things persist? And then what are the consequences for us today if we still have those practices that have specific economic roots, but now the economic systems have changed, and so how do they still affect us? And so things like the very high number of single mothers in South Africa, given that the lobola still exists, might be a consequence of those historic practices. So I think that's fascinating things to study, and it shows how relevant history still is, even though we typically don't think of it that way.
Still on the topic of chapters that stood out to us, Phila and I were actually discussing one of the earlier chapters of your book, in where you compare the two games of Monopoly and the Settlers of Catan. So maybe perhaps you can better unpack that concept and how it applies to wealth, how it's not a zero-sum game to our viewers.
Yeah, I think this kind of anecdote sums up the entire book, right? So often we think of life as a zero-sum game, which means that if you win, I have to lose, and there are places where this is the case. If you participate in the Olympics, there can only be only one gold winner. So that's a zero-sum game. But the economy doesn't actually work like that, right? So in a market system, it's not like there's a fixed number of jobs available, and if some people get more jobs, others have to lose jobs. That's almost never the case. In an economy where there's economic growth, there's specialization, there's trade, it's a positive sum game. So you can create jobs without removing jobs from someone else. And so the way I kind of try and explain this is through this Monopoly, Settlers of Catan. Monopoly is a game where everyone starts with an equal amount of money, and ultimately there's one winner and everyone else has got no money, right? So that's how most people think the world works. It's a zero-sum game. Whereas Settlers of Catan is basically everyone starts with one little village and a road, and then you play, you throw the dice. There's resources that are distributed. You start trading, and ultimately, okay, certainly one person wins, and the first, I think, person with 10 points or whatever. But by the end of the game, when that person wins, everyone else has got a thriving little civilization as well, right? So that kind of gives you a much better sense of what the economy is like. It's not like that person who won took the 10 points from everyone else. Everyone was had an economy was growing. That person was just first over the finish line. And I think that's a much better way to think about society and the way that an economy can create prosperity. To put it very simply, 300 years ago, everyone in the world, basically everyone, was poor, right? At today's poverty rate, everyone was poor. And today, despite terrible things that happened, right? Despite colonialism in Africa, despite the First and the Second World War, the world on average is 18 times more affluent than it was, right? So with 8 times more people and 18 times more affluent, each of those individuals. So that you cannot create that kind of wealth by redistributing from certain people to other people. It must be through a positive sum game. And that's what the economy is. It's a positive sum game where we all can win.
Yeah. So when you speak about, the wealth today relative to the wealth 200 years ago, or the dialect thereof, I'm reminded of Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. He phrases it quite differently in there. He says that 200 years ago, 90% of the population lived below the poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today, as I think $1 or so a day. And obviously you can understand that because there was a feudal system in place, and even before then, yet more oppressive systems. But when you fast forward to today, 200 years from then, the situation is completely reversed. 90% of the population today live above the poverty line and only 10% live below it. Now, of course, that 10% is still a staggering number, and of course, something must be done about it. But we must be able to look objectively at the facts and realize that actually the improvement that we've made is quite significant. So just maybe to the point that you've made about Monopoly and Settlers of Catan, we probably should have started on this point, but thanks, Simo, for raising it. So when I was reading that, I of course was thinking a lot about not only the economy more broadly, but to certain facets of the economy. So when I think about the stock market, for example, I'm not sure if that same Monopoly Settlers of Catan anecdote will work. Would the stock market be a spanner in the works of that explanation, or is it built into the explanation that you give?
Well, no, I certainly think it's a Settlers of Catan story rather than a Monopoly story. But sure, they are, you can sell at the wrong time and or buy high and sell low, or sell low and buy high, and that seems to be more like a zero sum game. But remember, if you just look at the long run of the stock market, it's created so much wealth over the 20th century, right? So I mean, a great example is like the two funds that established Stellenbosch University, right? One of them, the donor said you are only allowed to buy government bonds, and the donor said you can buy stock as well. And that fund, the bonds one, it was 200,000 pounds, I think initially. It's now I don't know. So let's say 30 million rand. The other one was also 200,000 pounds, but that's now above 1 billion rand, right? So the kind of wealth that was created by the stock market in terms of mining stock, and then later obviously manufacturing kind of firms, and now more like services and NASPERS and these kind of things, it's just far superior to anything that you could have invested in over the 20th century. So it's created all this kind of wealth. But sure, if you're a day trader and you buy and sell and you hope to make a little bit of a profit, then it's going to seem more like the stock market is a zero sum game. Because if you're a stock trader and you win a little bit today, then presumably someone had lost a little bit. But if you're an investor and you buy now and you sell again in 20 years, it's going to be it's a positive sum game. You're going to make money over that term if you buy an index fund, for example. And I think that's really it's a reflection, right? So it's not the stock market itself that creates the money. It's firms that you invest in, and that those firms, they use that capital to invest and expand and so forth. So as long as that process is allowed to continue, then the investors in those firms will see the dividends and the returns.
Thanks. So I noticed on many occasions when you speak of the African situation, you are quite positive. And so a part that did stick out to me in the book was actually right at the very end, the final paragraph in your epilogue. I'd like to read out the quote that you quoted yourself from David Lanz. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. In this world, the optimists have it, not because they are always right, but because they are positive. Even when wrong, they are positive. And that is the way of achievement, correction, improvement, and success. Educated, eyes open optimism pays. Pessimism can only offer the empty consolation of being right. So as I said earlier, I noticed much of the book, you're very, very positive about what I will call the African situation. In various chapters, you highlight the fact that we are better off now than we were in the past. You make a note of our positive trends, like our strides towards ameliorating inequality, our GDP growth, how countries like Botswana are growing quickly. You even talk about height, how we're much taller now than we were quite a while ago. All this and more contributes to a generally positive outlook you express in the book on the prospects of Africa doing well. My question is, in a country where social and political instability is extremely high, we hear words like junk status, soaring prices, state capture, load shedding, corrupt politicians in the news almost every day. And we also can't ignore the impact of COVID. How do we maintain this positive outlook on our future? I mean, I'm even tempted to ask, how are you still positive on the prospects of us as a country doing well?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because it is not always easy to remain positive, right? So I think partly the reason I wrote the book was also because I've experienced my students becoming more pessimistic over the last decade. But I think partly that is, it's super justified, right? South Africa certainly has done pretty bad the last decade. We've now experiencing negative economic growth over during and before COVID even, and the outlook is not always very optimistic. So I understand that. Then it's also important for me to realize that my students, many of them first years can't remember the 2010 FIFA World Cup, right? They were too young to really experience it in any way. And so the South Africa that they've experienced is very different from the South Africa that I experienced, right? So the South Africa when I kind of, entered adulthood was a South Africa with extreme optimism. There were many things we were concerned about, HIV/AIDS, all these kind of things that obviously also were important. But we also had a growth rate of 4%, 5% when I started my job here. We were building an electric car. We had an electric car shown at the 2007 Paris Motor Show, right before Elon Musk had built his first Tesla. And there was so much optimism. I remember actually telling my wife that we should buy a electric car. We should save for it because it's going to the Joule is going to be in production soon. And so there was so much optimism, and then we took a wrong turn, right? We shifted towards a more state-led orientation or approach. We know of, as you mentioned, the corruption, state capture. Yet the rest of the world didn't go that way. So if you actually look at global growth, you see a kind of a strong trend upwards. South Africa is the kind of outlier. There's obviously one or two other outliers as well, but we are the one that is not reflecting the kind of optimistic story of the rest of the globe. And so I thought it's kind of important to firstly tell students that South Africa is not inevitably doomed, right? I'm not saying we will do better. It's this eyes open optimism that you reflected. Our eyes are open. It's not to say that we are missing all the load shedding and the water shedding and all of these kind of things that are happening at the moment. We are very realistic, but it's also not to say that inevitably we're doomed to just have a failed state, right? I think if you go back to the early 1990s, I was too young to experience this, but you can read about this and you realize just the incredible pessimism there is about South Africa, right? So many people, late 1980s, people believe we're going to have a civil war. Education is in a terrible state for most of South Africa's population. There's very high levels of poverty. We've got very high levels of inflation. We've had more than 10% inflation for more than a decade. We've had very high levels of public debt. There's actually no hope for South Africa, right? And then yet, within 10, 15 years, we turn it around with these high growth rates. Our debt comes down. We have low inflation, lower interest rates. So that's a remarkable turnaround. So if we could do it then, there's no reason that we can't do it again, right? That's the point. And the important thing here is, in a couple of places in the book, I think I mentioned this, is that many of the people who became fabulously rich were people who were willing to take on those risks during times when everyone else was saying, it's too dangerous, I'm quitting, right? And so I think the successful entrepreneurs are those that are willing to take on those risks and succeed. And I think in South Africa, of course, we need the private sector, we need the entrepreneurs, we need the investment. We also need, of course, the politicians to do the right thing and get the kind of right policies in place. But I don't think we should think that this will never happen. It's not to say that it will happen, but I think we need to be optimistic and think that if we do the right thing, we can again return to a place where we experience economic growth. And I should add that that economic growth was not just for the rich. This was poverty declined from 37% to 7%, like a massive decline in poverty. And then since then we see actually poverty increase again. So it was just a time when we could see the fruits of our labor, whereas now we've had a decade, even more than a decade now, where we don't, and that is frustrating. It's obviously worsened by COVID, but the hope must be there that it can turn around.
Yeah, so I've actually got two comments on what you've just said. The first is about a chapter in the book that also I think very clearly elucidates what you're talking about now, which is called "Cry for Me, Argentina," if I've got it correctly. Because I think what it points to is the corollary of what you're saying. So Argentina was one of the most prosperous societies in the world, but when we look at them today, they're hovering right at the bottom among such countries as South Africa, which, if you had told an Argentinian all those years ago that this would be the case, they would probably not even believe you. So I do think that there's a danger with optimism in the sense that it invites a kind of complacency. And I think we need to be wary of that. But I also think, as the second sort of comment to make, I think, when we talk about, obviously, the pessimism that a lot of students in your lectures come with, I think a lot of it is a product of the media and the way in which the media is reported. And you touch on the negativity bias in your book, which I think is a very apt sort of a description of why people feel like this. Because there's also a sense in which, as Steven Pinker again points out in The Better Angels of Our Nature, I believe it was, where we're talking about that violence levels have gone down quite precipitously. I think that there's a sense in which the media contributes to this, because it's very easy to sell a negative story. It's much more difficult to sell a positive story. It's much more difficult to sell the story of a place that was once in war that is now peaceful, or a place that was once impoverished but that is now prosperous. Those kind of things don't really sell in the media, and I think a lot of the pessimism is fueled by such news. So how do you think we can combat that kind of negativity that is spewed out at this high production rate in the mainstream? Because I do think that it's deluding a lot of young people into thinking that we're far worse than we actually are, when I think we've got a lot of gratitude that we owe to those who have come before us.
Well, I think everyone should buy my book and read it. I don't want to blame the media, because I think, it's perfectly irrational for them to do what they do, right? They want to sell newspapers and online clicks and all of these kind of things, increasingly so. So for them to then try and tell these kind of positive stories, they ultimately, you're going to lose out to the guy who sells the negative news, because that's what people want to buy, that's what they want to read. We, as you've mentioned, humans have a negativity bias. We want to make sure that when there's a lion, we run. We don't want to have the kind of positive story about the grass is nice and green on this side if there's a lion sitting on it, right? So that is a problem of the type of media or the type of information that we consume. So I don't want to say the newspapers need to change their stories. They're never going to change it. If they do change it, they're going to lose out to those that do sell the negative stories. So the market will ultimately dictate that the media is negative. But I do think, through better kind of education, so that's partly, I'm in the education industry, so I think that's, we need to create a citizenship which are aware that they are consuming media that is negatively biased, right? So if you're in my class, then hopefully you say, well, actually, there are these long-run trends where you can see that things are improving rapidly. The sad thing, I think, is that this is not the case in all faculties, right? I think that certainly in my course, you would be exposed to these kinds of ideas. But I think there are courses at this university and at many other universities where you are never exposed to the idea that we are living much better lives than our ancestors did. In fact, many people would say we are living much worse, even though there's no factual support for those kinds of statements. But it's almost partly because the idea of fact is being questioned in many faculties and many ideologies that it's difficult to make this case in those kind of places. So to give you an example, I give a guest talk at a different department than my own, and at the end of that talk every year, I get this long queue of students who say, why have we never been exposed to these ideas before? And I'm just baffled. Like, this should not be news to you. This, you can just type in Wikipedia, what is the long run decline in poverty like, and you will get the figures, right? Our World in Data is a public resource. You can get anything under the sun that you want there. But the idea that we can use data or we can use statistics to tell a story about human progress it's an idea that's fundamentally questioned in many disciplines these days. And I just think that's silly. Of course, we can, say that the world is a much better place in terms of higher levels of income, in terms of our ability to consume, population size, all of these things that we can measure. And of course, we can then also say, perhaps there are things that are not as great as they were. Maybe we should care also about, biodiversity. And then you would say, well, actually, in the richest of the rich countries, biodiversity is improving over the last 5 decades or so. So that's great, right? That means that we actually, if we're a rich society, we can pay for the things that we care about. So we can now spend money on improving the environment. And so those kind of things are, wonderful types of discussions to have. But if you don't believe in statistics, then we won't be able to ever have those kinds of discussions. So I do think that we are missing something in our education system that exposes students to these kinds of ideas. And that's partly why I actually really hope that the book does well outside of only my discipline. Right? It shouldn't just be economists who read this. It should be everyone, and especially those in the humanities, I think, would benefit a lot from reading this.
Yeah, so that's partly why I thought that chapter or that dichotomy that you drew between Monopoly and Settlers of Catan was so crucial, because I think the error that a lot of people make here is in trying to view optimism, the realization that we've improved over the past few decades. They want to try and paint that sort of progress with the dichotomy of, the stagnation and all the errors that we have today. So to them, it's either you recognize that we're doing good, or you recognize that societies are falling deeper and deeper into an abyss, and that we need to find ourselves out of that abyss in which we presently find ourselves. When I think you do the good job of, clarifying that these needn't be mutually exclusive viewpoints, that you can hold both of them concurrently. And I think that's the crucial takeaway here, that you can realize that there's lots of progress that has been made, whilst also realizing that there's a lot more progress still to be made, and that's where we are to continue growing.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think the another issue I would highlight is that, I'm not saying by saying that there's been so much progress, that doesn't mean that the things in the past that we think are, terrible things that happened was good, right? That's what also people are hearing, is the fact that I say, the world has become so much more affluent. That means I think colonialism or apartheid or all of these kind of slavery was somehow a good thing. That's certainly not what I'm saying. I mean, in fact, these are the things that I study, right? And I know that that's exactly, if they didn't happen, there would have been much more rapid progress. So I study how those types of events were debilitating. Like, what did they do? Apartheid was an incredibly debilitating event or set of policies then that limited the economic freedoms, right? So the fact that these policies were removed actually allowed us to kind of to grow to levels far beyond that we thought we could. So certainly that, but somehow that's often confused, is the fact that we can both agree that these things were bad, and to still say, despite those kind of inhibiting factors, we did manage, because of science, because of technology, did manage to do incredibly well. And we can do even better if we continue to remove those kinds of inhibiting regulations and discriminatory laws and those kind of things. So I think that's really an important point also to make.
Sure. When talking about Africa's political failures and their dictator regimes, one of the chapters actually discusses that. You remark that it took centuries of conflict for democratic institutions to emerge in Europe, and why should we expect the process to be any less painful in Africa? That stood out to me because I kept thinking, what if this is the process? Africa as a whole is still relatively newly independent. I don't think we have 100 years in the bank yet. So I kept thinking that, what if this is the process, and we are coming from like real oppression? Maybe these are the growing pains, and we'll figure it out. I mean, the fact that we are talking about it is actually a very, very good start. It's part of that eyes open optimism approach. Yeah. So, Prof. Fourie, I would just like to ask about perhaps you can shed light on the relevance of the book to our people today. What most can they gain from reading?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point to make, and I think that's partly also my frustration is it's actually pretty remarkable that a continent that gained its independence 60 years ago or so, with also borders that are they are mostly, or many of them at least, are dictated by this colonial oppressors, right? They weren't designed by the inhabitants themselves, and yet there's almost no international conflict in Africa over these borders, right? So Europeans, I mean, we're in the middle of a European war after centuries of European conflict. You would have thought that these borders are now at least finally, set in stone, but they're not. Like, there's again a war in Ukraine and Russia, and yet in Africa, with outside enforced borders, there's almost no international conflict. There's no countries that fight between one another, right? All the conflicts in Africa are within countries, like civil conflicts. Right?
I think it's been such a hugely, hugely enjoyable conversation. For me, as I said earlier, I mean, it's presented to me and unlocked a world that I didn't even know existed. I didn't know that it was possible to look at history from an economic lens in the way that we have done today, and in the way that you have so eloquently done in your book. Like, it really is remarkable. And yeah, I'm really, really thankful that I was able to read the book, and I was able to actually discuss the contents of the book with you. So do you, by any chance, have any final comments for our listeners and viewers? Other than that, they need to buy the book.
Well, obviously, buy the book. Maybe I can mention that I try and blog once a week. So if people are interested in these ideas, they can go to, I think it's johanfourie.substack.com, or just johanfourie.com. It's also my website. So it'd be wonderful for people to sign up. It's free. And I write for various newspapers, and so you'll get some of those ideas also in your inbox every Monday.
Sure thing. One final comment from my side. I just wanted to compliment the naming of the chapters. I really enjoyed. There's one that actually says, "Why would you want to eat dim sum in Transkei?" It's quite playful. I enjoy that for a book that's pretty much in the line of a textbook. You made it very interesting while still being informative at the same time. So I've got to commend you for that.
I was
So,
accused of clickbait
with that
titles.
being that,
I never thought of them as clickbait titles, but then when someone mentioned that they are clickbait titles, I realized that that's exactly what they are. So yeah, thanks.
They are. I mean, there's another one that says, "Why should we cry for Argentina?" That's a play on words, and the song and the movie and Argentina.
No, thanks also, Phila and Simo. That's really a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that your listeners will enjoy it too.
I actually have no doubt that they will. I mean, the kind of conversations that we've had in the past, I think the one conversation that was screaming out to be had was exactly this one. So yeah, I can't say anything other than that. We are extremely grateful. I mean, it really is quite remarkable, and yeah, long may it continue.
As a final note to our listeners and viewers, get this book. We will also have links in our bio. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share as much as you can. I mean, every time. And we'll catch you guys next time.
Cheers.